In this video, I'll be talking about Prince Escalus, a character from William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. As always with my videos in this series, I'm not going to cover absolutely everything about the prince, but what I think are the most important aspects of his character and what I think will be of most importance to you walking into an exam, should you get a question on him. So first of all, you might want to talk about his name and his title. So his title is Prince. So immediately that indicates he is of royal blood, and that Verona is ruled by a monarch. Escalus could be a variant of the Greek author's name Escalus, who was often described as the father of tragedy. He was believed to be kind of the first writer, if you like, of a Greek tragedy. So does this foreshadow the tragedy that Prince Escalus creates? You could argue he creates it, you could argue against that. Another interpretation that I see quite a lot and is very valid is it could be closely linked to the word scales, and that is a symbol of balance and justice, and you could certainly say that Prince Escalus is a symbol in this play of those things, and we'll look at that a bit closer later in the video. So just a quick thing on context, thinking about the Elizabethan audience watching this play, a prince like Prince Escalus wouldn't seem that unusual to them. They had Queen Elizabeth, who was an absolute monarch. So in other words, she reigned all aspects of her kingdom, and they're going to see very similar levels of power with Prince Escalus as well. So that'd be something that they could relate to. So immediately we see that he is an absolute ruler. The reason being, he is given the first monologue of the play, so it immediately emphasises his importance. Look at the way he refers to the Montagues and the Capulets who are fighting. He calls them rebellious subjects. Especially referring to them as subjects reminds them of their position, and you might argue more importantly, reminds them of his authority. This is a very popular quote from Prince Escalus: "If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace." So this threatening dialogue emphasises his absolute power. He is able to sentence his subjects to death. It could be argued that actually his dialogue is prophetic, because if by them disturbing the streets again, and they will in Act 3 Scene 1, many deaths will pay the forfeit. We're going to see Mercutio, Tybalt, Paris, Romeo and then Juliet die, and you could argue it's all because of that next brawl in Act 3 Scene 1. So it might not be the way he thought it would be, because obviously he's saying I'll execute you, but it is very much true. Also look at stage directions. Whenever he enters the stage, so Act 1 Scene 1 and Act 3 Scene 1, the fighting stops immediately. So that helps also establish the power of his authority. Although he is an absolute ruler of the people, you could argue he has no power over fate, and that's the ultimate power in this society, and we'll talk about that in context for a moment. And he even admits to that, you might argue, in Act 5 Scene 3, when he says to the parents of Romeo and Juliet, "Heaven finds means to kill your joy." In other words, fate. So let's have a think about the context. Queen Elizabeth I was not above the law. She did have to act in accordance with it, but she had great power, like we see in Prince Escalus. As an example, she could determine whether a person would be executed, like we see with Prince Escalus. But interesting, we've just talked about fate, and that would definitely be in line with the way the Elizabethans thought. So they believed in this concept of the great chain of being. So they believed in this giant hierarchy, if you like, that included everything in the universe. And at the very top was God, because God is perfect. And the hierarchy was then determined depending on how close to perfection you were or how far away you were. So at the very bottom of hierarchy would be the least perfect being. So somewhere in the middle would be human beings. You might argue that they would place animals below humans and whatnot. And they would typically expect the nobility, especially a queen or a prince, to be very high, if not just under God, because they were expected to be as close to perfect as possible. So that gives you this idea that yes, Prince Escalus does have this power over his people, but he's not God. So his power can only go so far, and we see that in the play. He can't save Romeo and Juliet. This concept of this great chain of being is linked to the concept of providence, and that is that God is the power guiding human destiny. And again, you can argue you see that in this play, that God guides the destiny of Romeo and Juliet, and it's the only way that the feud can end, because even Prince Escalus can't stop it. He definitely wants peace. He talks of, in the very first line of his first monologue in Act 1, Scene 1, he refers to those rebellious subjects as enemies of peace. So it immediately establishes his priority, and that is to keep peace. He says they are profaners of this neighbour-stained steel. Profaners is basically someone who misuses something, okay? So he's basically saying you're misusing your swords, okay? It makes a clear statement that the sword should be used for defensive means only, not for vengeance, and certainly not against one another. So really the idea here is we have swords to defend ourselves as a community from outside threats. It's not something we should be drawing against one another. So he's very much for this idea of maintaining peace. So a key feature of Elizabethan drama is to teach its audience to be good citizens. So you'd see that would be quite a common theme in dramas, not just Shakespeare's but others as well, and to put forward a view of history that supported the establishment, this idea that, you know, to be for peace, to have harmony, you must have this strong leadership, you should have this strong establishment. So its portrayal of the feuding families would remind the audience of the importance of stable leadership, and you could even link that to the conflict between Catholics and Protestants at the time, and how important it was to have this stable leader, this reasonable leader that they believed was Queen Elizabeth I at the time. He's definitely very controlled and level-headed, okay? He refers, again, we've talked about this a few times, he refers to the Montagues and Capulets who were fighting in Act 1, Scene 1 as beasts. That animalistic imagery creates a contrast between them, these young men that are behaving like animals, that are wild, with the civilised manner of the prince that we see all the way through. He's definitely a calming influence. We've talked, haven't we, already about how whenever he enters the stage, the fighting ends. So he does have this calming influence on others. Also thinking about what Lord Capulet says about the punishment he received for the first brawl, but Montague's bound as well as I in penalty alike. So, and this is him talking about Paris, and he's basically saying, I received the same punishment as Lord Montague. So the language of comparison highlights the equal treatment of both families. The prince rules fairly, and that's something that was really important to the Elizabethans at the time. My blood for your rude brawls doth lie a bleeding. So this is in Act 3, Scene 1, because Mercutio has died, and Mercutio is one of the prince's kinsmen. So he's lost one of his own. So now he's affected by this feud personally. So the personal possessive pronoun my emphasises how the feud has affected him personally, yet his judgment of banishing Romeo rather than killing him is free of personal vengeance. If he was vengeful, he would have said kill him, but he didn't. He said banish him. He gave him the gentler judgment. So he's definitely someone who's very calm, reasonable, rational and unbiased. So he's definitely this ideal leader, and you might argue that overall, not completely because she definitely had her enemies, but overall Queen Elizabeth I was a popular monarch. It could have something to do with the fact that she followed King Henry VIII, who was horrendous. For one reason, they were always at war during his reign. And he was very tyrannical, and obviously he's famous for the way he treated his wives. So maybe she was just a welcomed change from from King Henry, but she was popular, she was respected. So Prince Escalus represents the idealised monarch, much like Queen Elizabeth I was viewed by many of her subjects at the time. But it is also worth considering that the future of theatre was really fragile at this time. There was many arguments against the theatre. Shakespeare really needed the support of the Queen. And so he was never going to present a leader in a negative light in case anyone thought that actually this was his way of criticising the Queen. So the likelihood is he was never, ever, ever going to create Prince Escalus in a negative light, because it would not have been well received by the Queen at the time. So something to consider. The prince is definitely merciful, who now the price of his dear blood doth owe. Okay, so this is trying to understand the rationale behind him banishing Romeo instead of killing him, which he said he would do in Act 1, Scene 1. If you ever fight again, I'll sentence you to death. But he doesn't. He banishes Romeo. So the rhetorical question reveals how he rationalises Romeo's banishment. These murders are fuelled by vengeance, and executing Romeo will only add to this. His aim is not to rule with violence, but to create harmony. So the prince realises, yeah, I could keep to my word and sentence you to death. But you know what? That means that the Montagues are going to go out and try and seek revenge for your death. And it doesn't stop. So I'm going to banish you. I just want this to end. So he prioritises harmony over sticking to his threat. Even Friar Lawrence refers to that as a gentler judgment when he tells Romeo that he's been banished. So the adjective really depicts the prince as compassionate. And at the end he says, some shall be pardoned and some punished. The conflicting response highlights the conflict between law and mercy, and the difficulties in finding that balance. When do you be this really strict leader and put an end to things and just sentence them to death? When do you show mercy? And I think that's a really difficult balance that Prince Escalus potentially struggles with in this play. Now, you could critically analyse everything that you've said about Prince Escalus. We've mostly talked about him being positive. But, you know, is he a weak leader? He mentions in Act 1, Scene 1, there's been 3 civil brawls now. So the exposition reveals that there have now been 3 civil brawls. Does this not suggest that Prince Escalus has failed to control his subjects? He's a failed leader. Okay, he clearly isn't respected because they keep fighting, and we're going to see them fight again in Act 3, Scene 1. We're going to see Romeo go back even though he's been banished. It doesn't sound like this prince is actually respected as much as we might think. He says, mercy but murders, pardoning those that kill. So there he's basically saying, if I give mercy to those that kill, then aren't I just encouraging them to kill again? But isn't that what he's guilty of? By pardoning those that fight at the beginning of the play, and then Romeo in Act 3, Scene 1, more deaths will result. He could have ended this in Act 1, Scene 1. If he'd sentenced them all to death, would that not have stopped it? So it's just, maybe that's really harsh because, you know, hindsight is 20/20. But it could be a valid argument. And then even Prince Escalus in the end says, an eye for winking at your discords too. He takes responsibility. I've helped create this because I was too lenient. So even he admits he has been too lenient. But I think take into consideration the times that this was written. The prince showing remorse would actually appeal to an Elizabethan audience, and they wouldn't consider it a weakness. They would consider it to be a strength. And I'm supporting that with a very influential treatise at the time called The Education of a Christian Prince by Erasmus, and that asserted that a Christian prince should cast aside all personal motives and use only reason and judgment. And we always see that from him. Whenever he says anything, there's a reason behind it, there's a rationale behind it. He's never emotional with his decisions. He's always trying to think about the results of his actions and create harmony, even though he isn't able to in the end. And always remember to think about, why would Shakespeare create such a character? What is their function? I would argue that he's a catalyst, okay? By banishing Romeo, it helps lead to the eventual deaths of Romeo and Juliet. He's an example of a good Christian leader, something that the Elizabethan audience would respect. And you might argue maybe it's Shakespeare sucking up to Queen Elizabeth I because he needs her support. And also he's really a symbol of the importance of balance between punishment and mercy, or law and mercy as well, and how difficult a balance that is, how difficult it is to actually effectively lead when you have rebellious subjects. As always, I would love to hear your own ideas. Please leave comments. I don't always respond, but I always press like to show that I've read them.